Reddit Ask Me Anything. I am a doctor working behind the scenes in the Hong Kong protests. Ask me anything. For the last few months Hong Kong has been afflicted by protests with increasingly violent confrontations between protesters and the police. Many injured protesters avoid going to the hospital because they will likely be arrested. However, through a network of groups, volunteer doctors and nurses are providing medical care instead. On weekday nights I participate as one of the hidden doctors, treating protesters, sometimes in my own home. Ask me anything. Edit. I stated in some of my earlier responses that I didn't think the police would go after doctors and nurses yet. I've heard reports that many have been arrested at Polytechnic University. The situation there is pretty bad. Do you ever worry about officials finding out that you do this? What would happen if they did? Yes, I do. We try to be very careful. I am using a VPN and a throwaway account. We communicate using Telegram. Right now the police are focused on the violent protesters. There are some people in yellow vests who try to mediate conflicts, providing food and water, urging the police and protesters to scale back violence. However, it may not be long before they start going after those they see as collaborating. If so, people like me will be charged as being complicit in whatever crimes. Not a medical question. Why are the Hong Kong police so loyal to China and not their own citizens? Like what most comments say below, it's their job. Some are sympathetic with China but most are from Hong Kong. Salute to you. What injuries are most commonly seen? The most common injuries I treat are from excessive tear gas exposure or bruises from rubber bullets and batons. The worst injuries are broken bones and those with difficulty breathing. Broken bones can be treated on site, but for some severe cases I had to bring them back home, where I've set up a makeshift clinic. I have yet to see someone with life-threatening injuries, but there are unfortunately some cases that I'm aware of. Thank you for your service. How do you foresee this conflict ending? I'm not sure. The government has withdrawn the extradition bill, but the protests have long moved beyond that. Had they done that within a few days of the first protest, this would have all been over quick. But the government is stubbornly unresponsive and the scary rhetoric from the mainland isn't helping. Bro, that's insane. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. One question I have is how you create a safe, sterile environment to treat people when needed. And what's the worst you've seen or had to deal with? We usually set up makeshift clinics near conflict zones and disinfect a small area. For example, I bring disinfected sheets and lay them out. The worst I've seen was when a protester was hit in the head with a rubber bullet and then beat pretty badly. They managed to escape and I was contacted because I was working nearby. They were bleeding badly from the head and had bruises on one of his legs. His arm, however, looked badly damaged. I think they tried to block the baton with their arm. This was a case where I had to bring them back to my home. I had a table set up and stock medical supplies. No skull fractures. Just a few bruises from a rubber bullet. Leg had a small fracture, but the damage to the arm was more severe. We patched them up as best as we could and then connected them with a private clinic which could give an x-ray. This feels incredibly dystopian. I'm sorry you're in that situation. My question: have you had any police come round to your house to try and find any patients you've been treating harboring? If so, how did you hide your impromptu surgery suite? Thank you for what you are doing. How can Americans or other countries help? Many of the protesters look to America, the UK, and other countries for help and guidance. This has been misconstrued by mainland propaganda to show that the unrest is fomented by foreign powers. In America there is a bill that is passing through which I am told has strong support. That will review whether Hong Kong can still be considered independent. This is good and puts our government on notice. However, it's hard to see how we can get our governments to listen to us, even with foreign countries engaging diplomatically. This time around the government has been especially stubborn. We are all afraid about how it will end. What is the ultimate end goal for the protesters in Hong Kong and how do you see it all playing out? Peace and love from Ireland. The protesters are not strictly a united organization. The 5 demands were put out, of which only one, arguably the least important, has been met. A few of the rest, an independent investigation into police brutality, are only being met on a surface level. The organization they directed with this investigation has no actual power, and the protesters know this. I feel like this might be the last chance for Hong Kong to stand up for itself. The rhetoric from the mainland has been scary. I fear that if the protests die out like in 2014, we will never get another chance to organize. The only long-term solution is for the government to implement the democratic reforms that were promised during the handover. These protests stem, after all, from an unresponsive government, because that government is a sham democracy. But I don't know if that is how it will end. What will you do if the government becomes aware of what you're doing? Where will you go? So far they appear too busy with the protesters to go after the collaborators. I think they would only start coming after those like me if the mainland intervenes. If that's the case, Hong Kong is finished and I will try to flee. I will definitely feel guilty, but many of us have backup foreign passports in case of a situation like this. What's your opinion about the protests? Are there any polices or other social workers that also help the citizens? I participated in many of the peaceful protests when the extradition bill was introduced. I participated in previous protests in Hong Kong as well. I am old enough to remember British rule. Once you have a taste of freedom, it is very hard to let go. The young protesters today were born under Chinese rule, and they are trying to protect what little freedom is left. However, as a medical professional, it strictly doesn't matter whether I sympathize with the protesters. They are not receiving the medical treatment they need because they don't go to the hospitals, so I must be there to provide it instead. I can't really say the police help the protesters, but some try to minimize the brutality. This is hard to do, given the rhetoric from the mainland. There are groups of yellow vest neutrals that try to mitigate conflicts between the police and protesters. I'm so glad people like you are helping. They must be so grateful. My question is about your home setup. This may sound dumb, but what kind of setup is it? Like, do you have a makeshift hospital room in a guest room? Or do you have stuff hidden that you can pull out when you need it? Also, what kinds of injuries are you set up for? It's not much. I have sterilized and repurposed a table for examining and treating patients. I have been stocking medical supplies from my day job to treat injuries at home. I also have more potent solutions for treating tear gas expose. But beyond that, I am not set up to deal with serious injuries. For those patients, I do the best I can and set them up with a private clinic who can perform further treatment. Are you being compensated for your work, or do you have a way of being funded? I would like to donate to this. You are helping and I want to help you. No, this is purely volunteerism on my part and others. I stock medical supplies from my day job at my home and some contacts to get more potent tear gas treatments. I am glad that you are willing to help, but I am not aware of any donation outlets. After all, we are just a loose network of medical professionals. Have you ever been close to getting caught? If so, how? I don't think I've been close to getting caught because the police aren't yet going after people like us. I'm sure they are aware of what we are doing. However, and if the government succeeds in stifling the protests, or if the mainland intervenes, it is very likely they will come after those like me to set an example. How does it personally feel to perform this work in the HK situation? I mean, how does the excessive amount of violence affect you or those who come to you for help? Is it disheartening, enraging, or anything like that? It is not enraging, but it is disheartening. The young protesters are strong and brave. They go into the conflicts with police ready to be injured. I have yet to meet any protesters that have been traumatized or afflicted mentally by the conflict. However, passerbys who are caught in conflicts may not fare so well if they are injured. Personally, I lament that it has come to this. I start to think that we and the British were naive to believe that China would implement the promised democratic reforms. And maybe they never intended to anyway. There should have been a better way to keep them accountable, of which there is currently none but to protest. Do you have any advice for protesters? In terms of medical injury advice, in general, don't fight, but avoid the police. But fights are inevitable now. If you are exposed to tear gas, make sure you remove all your clothing. Many of the makeshift clinics stock clean clothing. Remove contacts and wash your eyes with lots of water. There are a few home remedies that are used to treat tear gas exposure: vinegar, vegetable oil, lemonade, and milk. I personally recommend salt water. Also, if you are physically injured and need medical treatment, please reach out. The big group on Telegram is the Hidden Clinic. How is freedom reduced now compared to British rule times? How can UK citizens help? What is mainland propaganda saying? Why did the citizens not stop after the bill was cancelled? Although we never had a true democratic government under British rule, we were treated much better and our rights and freedoms were strongly guaranteed. We were promised by the Chinese government that they would follow through with democratic reforms. This will probably never happen. The current government is taking a hard line against dissent and is unresponsive to its citizenry. Since the handover, the mainland has been subtle and overt attempts to squeeze the freedoms we have by introducing patriotic education bills, extrajudicial kidnappings which threaten freedom of speech, and imposing an increasingly Byzantine series of rules restricting protests and gatherings, making it harder for us to organize, and punishing foreign corporations for making the distinction between Hong Kong and China. UK citizens can help by expressing their support and helping us hold the Chinese government accountable for their promise. Mainland propaganda has been harsh, encouraging police and the government to take a hard line and to be ruthless. There have been hints at using military force to crush the protests, which would be the worst case scenario for us all. By the time the bill was cancelled and formally withdrawn, the protests had long since moved beyond the bill itself, down to the core of the issue. Had it been withdrawn after the first several protests, it is likely that would have been the end. How do they arrive? Is there some sort of ambulance? We set up close to the zones of conflict and use a makeshift gurney to transport the injured from the front lines to one of our makeshift clinics. We are contacted via some Telegram groups by those who were unable to find a nearby setup, usually a few hours after the main conflict has happened. Our network of doctors and nurses are relatively spread out, so they can find someone nearby. Why are these people protesting? Simply put, the Chinese government has never given us any of the promised democratic reforms and is increasingly clamping down on our remaining freedoms. Would you be a target for the police or do they let you do your work? It seems the police have been starting to arrest nurses and doctors who are suspected of assisting protesters. This is a new development, so I will need to be more careful. Did you have good medical equipment and resources or do you just have the first aid in your house? Also, is what you are doing not legal or fully legal? Also, a good job must be hard. I stock quality medical supplies at my home and bring them with me, including first aid, disinfectant, painkillers, for extraordinary cases, materials to make casts, etc. My setup at home is certainly makeshift, and the clinics we set up on the streets are not better. They are sterile. As much as we can do. Currently, no one is coming after us for what we are doing. But, in the future, if the government has its way, we may be prosecuted for collaboration. Otherwise, treating the injured outside of my day job is certainly legal. That's part of the medical profession. I worry for you and admire your bravery. How would you know if a protester who has been wounded is not working undercover? Also, do you see any of this ending? Please take good care of yourself. Thank you, but I am far from the ones most at risk. I don't know the extent to which undercover police officers are willing to go to stay undercover. I imagine if they are injured they would simply go to a hospital. However, it doesn't matter if they are a police officer or a protester. I would treat them nevertheless. It is my duty. There will be an end to the protests. What the ending will be, however, I am unsure and afraid. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content. It's free and that's a great price.